Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to another edition of the All Out Leadership Podcast. In fact, happy birthday. Background birthday music. Shangzhi Kuaila in Mandarin. That's happy birthday. Happy birthday to the All Out Leadership Podcast. This is episode number 52. All right, we're going to be picking up with God's leading. We looked last week at the Apostle Paul out of Acts chapter 16, where we see that God leads through starts, steps, and stops. And now I want to read to you what happened about the vision that God had given him when he finally comes to his last stop. God gives him his next step to take. Acts chapter 16 and verse 9. And a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia stood and pleaded with him, saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." Now, after he'd seen the vision, immediately we sought to go to Macedonia, concluding that the Lord had called us to preach the gospel to them. I actually like that last verse. We just concluded it was God. Most people go, if you had a vision, they're going to advertise on television, they're going to get a commercial, they're going to write a book. God gave me a vision. I like how humble they were. They just go, hey, I think God said something to us. So there's this man in this vision in Macedonia saying, come help us. So they travel, they get all the way over to the area of Philippi, Macedonia. They're over here. And what's interesting, when you read the rest of that passage, what you'll find is they were there several days and there was no man on the riverbank waiting for them saying, hi, I'm the man in the vision. Glad you're here. There were no welcome parties. There were no, welcome to Philippi. It was not there. So they're wandering around for several days in the city. Finally, the Sabbath day rolls around, and they find a group of women at the river praying and worshiping God, and they just begin to preach to them, minister to them. They come to Christ, and a revival begins to break out, and Paul's preaching, and a series of events happen. And they end up getting beaten and thrown into prison, and they're in a jail cell. And it's a powerful story how they're worshiping God at midnight. Every preacher loves that story. At the midnight hour, preaching. And we get into that. It's a great story. It really is. Now, but let's go back to how all this started. It started with a vision of a man in Macedonia saying, come over here. They haven't even met a man yet. They get there. There's no man waiting for them. And you know what they find? They find women at the river praying. Why? Because women were excluded from so much of the religious activities that they had to kind of have their own little Bible study, and they're down by the river. Paul goes, hey, they're hungry for God. We're going to give them God. What Paul is incredibly flexible in his vision. If you're not flexible in the vision that God has given you, understanding that what you see is an end picture, there's about 763,000 different steps in between where you are and where that's going to happen, and none of it's probably going to look like you thought. It's not going to work out the way you thought. It's not going to go the way you thought. You're not going to be celebrated like you were thought. You're not going to be everybody's hero like you thought. You're going to encounter criticism you never expected. You're going to have betrayals you never counted on. Just welcome to leadership. But Paul was not deterred by that. He was incredibly flexible inside of the vision that God gave him. When we started Element Church, we had a vision to reach people who love God or care about God, but just don't like church. And the visions that I had that would keep me up awake at 35 years old, the visions that caused me to lose sleep as thousands of people are giving their life to Christ, as the gospel's being taken around the world. So much of what has happened between that vision and where we're at today and the journey from point A to here, so much of it has not looked like the vision that God gave me. God didn't show Paul a prison cell and a jailer waiting to beat his back and lock him in the inner dungeon. God conveniently left that out of the vision. When God called Jesus, is walking on the beach, he sees Peter and John and James, and he goes, hey, come follow me. I'm going to make you fishers of men. Woo, that's awesome. That's exciting. We're gonna do bigger things. That's great. We're gonna be a disciple of Jesus. Jesus conveniently forgot to tell them. Well, he didn't forget. He just left it out. Oh, by the way, Peter, you're gonna die on a cross upside down. and you're all going to die, and it's going to be horrible deaths, and your family's probably going to die too. Jesus left out a lot of details inside of that. And oh, by the way, Peter, I'm going to rebuke you one day and call you Satan, and I'm going to make sure that's recorded in all of church history to many pastors can preach about it. He left that out. There's so many things that God leaves out when he's directing you. Why? Because we would run the other way, or we would just mess it up. And so just don't get discouraged when things don't work out the way that you think they should. You have to be flexible. I want to close with the story out of the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2. There was a man in the temple named Simeon, and then there was a lady named Anna. And both of them were very well along in age, 100 plus, and they were just old, and they just devoted themselves to God, devoted themselves to worship, devoted themselves to the things of God. And because they were so faithful and so close to the presence of God, God gave them a special promise and said, before you die, I'm going to let you see the Messiah. And they had been longing and waiting for the fulfillment of this promise. Well, one day, there's a poor carpenter who comes in with his wife, and they're holding a baby. And God tells them, this is the promised Messiah. This is the one that you've been waiting to see. Now, they had to be flexible when God spoke to them, because chances are they weren't looking for a baby to come into the temple. Chances are they're looking for a Messiah that's full grown, coming in riding a white stallion, bringing an army behind them to liberate Israel and defeat the Roman Empire. That's probably what they were looking for, just like every other Israelite. But when God said, no, this is the baby, and they adjusted and were able to adapt to go, mine eyes have seen the glory of God and of Israel. And if you aren't flexible to understand that there are times God shows you an end result, a full-grown vision. But when you really begin to see it unfold, you got to remember it starts out as a baby. No vision starts full-grown, and you have to be able to be flexible and not get discouraged when things don't grow as fast, it doesn't come to you as big, the sales aren't coming the way you thought, the revenue wasn't there, staff right there, the key people weren't there celebrating. Don't get discouraged, don't give up, and just be flexible, but hang on to the vision that God has given you.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.